Good evening, I'm Jeremy Fernandez, sitting in for Tony Jones, and welcome to Q&A. Here to answer your questions tonight, the Shadow Minister for Human Services, Linda Burney, the Religion Research Fellow at the Centre for Independent Studies, Peter Kurti, the renowned primatologist Jane Goodall, whose work with chimpanzees revolutionised our understanding of our own humanity, the Victorian Liberal Senator James Paterson, and writer and commentator Rachel Botsman, who's worried about the collapse of trust in our modern world. Please welcome our panel. Q&A is live on ABC TV and radio at 9:35 Eastern Standard Time, and you can stream us live on iView, YouTube, Facebook and Periscope. Our first question comes from Alex Soldatos.
Malcolm Turnbull's mocking of President Donald Trump has caused some controversy. But is it important for an Australian politician to be witty and colloquial, or does that just lead to a degree of unprofessionalism and negligence that damages our international relationships?
James Paterson.
One of the most common complaints I hear about politicians, or the most common feedback I get as a politician, is that you're all too uptight, you're all too straight-laced, you stick too much to the talking points, you're too boring, you don't really show us who you are as people. And frankly, I think often that's quite a valid criticism. So I am all for the Prime Minister showing a bit of levity, a bit of self-deprecation and, yes, engaging in a bit of a roast of others as well in public life. And I think that's an entirely healthy thing. Now, in this instance, it happened to be an off-the-record function and happened to leak, but I don't think it would be such a troubling thing if he gave a very similar speech in an on-the-record event.
We're talking about the President of the United States here.
Yes,
he's a volatile character.
And look, I can assure you that he's heard worse from others than the Australian Prime Minister. I don't think it's keeping him up at night. The Americans have a very similar dinner that they do, the White House Correspondents' Dinner. It's a very similar tradition where they engage in very similar kind of self-deprecation. I don't think that they'll be terribly shocked by it.
Linda Burney, would this episode make you trust a journalist less and make you more guarded?
Well, I went to the midwinter ball and I have to say I started to cringe a little bit when the Prime Minister did the imitation of Donald Trump. That went on and on and on. But it was funny and it was self-deprecating, and I think that was really important. But your relationship with journalists and my relationship with journalists has not changed at all because of that impersonation. But you do have to have a set of standards, whether it's on the record, off the record. And, of course, the symbiotic relationship between journalists and politicians is very important. We need each other. But you also, and my advice is particularly to young people aspiring to public life, if you think a journalist is your best friend, if there's a headline or a front page between that and you, then you'll get the front page and the headline. So you have to be very careful. I think the Prime Minister should have thought a little bit harder about doing that impersonation. And of course, it was never going to stay in 600 room of 600 people, with each one with an iPhone. Of course, it's not going to stay private.
He's had some good publicity out of it, though, and the criticism has been that if Bill Shorten had been more interesting, he would have been more popular.
Look, I thought both speeches were very, very good. And it's important to have that midwinter ball. Of course, let's remember why we have it. We have it to raise money for very worthwhile reasons, and that's the important part. Should Laurie Oakes have breached the trust of, it's all in-house? Well, that's another question, of course.
James, just very quickly to you, is Linda on the money there?
Oh, I think it's a great dinner. It raises a lot of money for charity. I've been a couple of times. I didn't actually go this year, and I really enjoy the speeches, and I think it shows a lighter, more human side of our politicians, and I don't think that's such a bad thing. I don't think it's a terribly significant thing that it's leaked. I don't think the US Free Trade Agreement is going to be scrapped tomorrow, or the Marines are going to be withdrawn from Darwin. So I'm pretty relaxed about it.
Rachel, this raises an interesting question about trust in the media at a function where it was Chatham House rules. Does this sort of thing breach the sort of trust that we have in institutional bodies like the media, like politicians?
See, I take a different view on this. I mean, I keep coming back to, why did he poke the bear? I mean, he's tech-savvy. He knows that Chatham House rules and off-the-record do not apply in the mobile age. I think he knew this video was going to be leaked, and there was a part of him that maybe thought he was going to look less subservient to Trump through the use of humour. I mean, he has enough people around him saying, you could have picked a different target. So, do we trust the media? I'm not sure even if I trust that this was who leaked the video. I'm not sure if there was slight collusion. But it does undermine our trust in the media, and it does raise the question, if nothing can be off the record, is there no line anymore between private and public life? And I think that is a very sad thing.
Let's stick with this theme of trust. Our next question is from Noah Keys-Askell.
Both of the major parties rely on political donations, but ordinary citizens like myself don't have hundreds and thousands of dollars in our pockets to give away to politicians. Are political donations a legal form of bribery? And if so, how can either of the major parties claim to represent Australian citizens when we know that their integrity is for sale?
Now, we'll come to the politicians in just a moment, but Peter, I want to go to you first. Is the suspicion of politicians and politicians well-founded, considering how money, influence, Chatham House rules are so readily exchanged behind closed doors away from the public?
Well, I wonder whether, in fact, we're seeing the end of Chatham House rules now. In fact, I just going back, touching on the question we just talked about, I really think that it's hard to imagine that you could really think that something wouldn't leak and that things are not... conversations can never be completely...
So was it calculated? Was Rachel right about that? Was this a calculated move to make Malcolm Turnbull seem like the everyman larrikin?
I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. But I think while satire, I think, is a great tool and it's a wonderful part of our cultural life, I wonder whether the Prime Minister of a country ought to use satire to poke somebody like the President of the United States, whatever you think of the current occupant of that office. But in terms of the question, Noah, that you've asked, I think political contributions are an important way for political parties to raise money. At least what we don't have in this country are the problems of fundraising that they have in the United States, where campaign finance is a really big and thorny issue. At least it's reasonably well regulated here, and it seems to me that most companies or corporations making donations to political parties will make a donation to each party, hedging their bets, I would think, in both ways. But in terms of the trust that people have in political parties, I think that's something that's earned by politicians. I think it's compromised by the style of media we have. But I don't think we can blame the media because we have social media. All of us have an iPhone. The point that Linda made, all of us have access to social media. In a sense, the way in which reporting takes place has changed. And I think that is changing our fundamental understanding of what trust amounts to in our community.
Jane, is the integrity of institutions up for sale?
Well, I think the integrity of institutions is being questioned more and more around the world. At least that's what I hear. But, you know, this really isn't my sphere of expertise. If it was chimpanzees we were talking about, it would be different.
Do they trade in this sort of, hierarchy and kind of, form special groups within themselves? I mean, are we behaving like chimps?
In a way we are. I mean, the male chimpanzees have a hierarchy and they compete for dominance, and some of them use blunt aggression and swagger around and, they show the characteristics of some politicians in some parts of the world. And others are more smart and they form alliances. And the ones who are smarter tend to last longer than the ones who just go in aggressively swaggering. And I personally hope that that'll be the same for some of our politicians too.
Now, Linda, you've been inside the New South Wales Labor Party, which is still trying to live down some very serious misdemeanours by Labor MPs. How do you shake off that reputational damage from your party when you're wearing the brand every day?
Well, obviously, what the New South Wales Labor Party went through before the 2011 election was horrendous and wrong, and the Labor Party paid the price dearly at that 2011 election. I've been a Member of Parliament, as all of you would know, for a long time now, 13 years in the New South Wales Parliament, 1 year in the Federal Parliament. And I believe that people do trust me, and I think that people want very simple things from their political leaders and the people that they put their trust in. They want to be listened to. They want to understand that you will take their hopes and loves and hurts and aspirations into the parliament. And they also want to be taken notice of. And those things are what we are bound to do as politicians. I take my responsibility very seriously, and most politicians do. There are some that haven't, which has tarnished the reputation of many. But my experience is that you don't go into political life to feather your own nest. You go in there to represent people, and that's why people put their trust in you, and that trust is sacrosanct, and you must repay it. That's your responsibility.
So that means the trust in Donald Trump that the American people have placed in him, Jane, is sacrosanct. Is it
some Americans?
Some American people,
and many
less than the majority,
are now
yes.
changing their minds.
Is that the sort of thing that happens in the primate world more broadly? That you have, your chief chimpanzee, who is not liked by the rest of them, and they then try to undermine.
That indeed happens. Yes, an alpha male can become very unpopular if he's one of the aggressive
And
types.
does it work? What's at stake?
What's at stake is that if you become the top one, you have more chance of siring more offspring, and that's one of the big things. So we cannot really actually compare chimpanzee politics with human politics, although it's very tempting.
I think that's a very good point.
All right, we'll move on to our next question, which is from Graham Rich.
I'm prompted by this trust set of comments, and in particular what perhaps Jane has said and what Rachel has referred to.
We just might, sorry, Graham, we'll just get you to start that question again. We're just waiting for the mic to get to you there. Go ahead.
Thanks. I'm prompted particularly by the conversation about trust and what Jane has referred to and what Rachel particularly has referred to. In an environment where we have an increasing number of online platforms, whether it be Bitcoin or Uber or Facebook, where there's peer-to-peer interaction that ignores all the traditional protocols, we've got a situation where trust becomes critical, which you refer to a lot, Rachel, in your presentations. And perhaps that trust is misplaced, or perhaps that trust is fair and reasonable. What I'm wondering is whether this leads increasingly towards anarchy, where everybody is able to do what they think in their own way and nobody's in charge.
Rachel.
So it's a great question. It touches on a massive and profound shift that we're seeing around trust. So, as we've talked about, trust is collapsing in institutions at an unprecedented rate. And the way I think of trust is it's a bit like energy. It can't actually be destroyed, it changes form. So when institutional trust is collapsing over here, what we see is these rise of distributed trust, whether that be through blockchain and Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, whether that be through marketplaces, whether it's Amazon or Uber or Airbnb, or whether that be through social media, so things like Facebook. The first thing I'm going to say is one is not necessarily better than the other, and that we are in a very precarious place. A world without institutions that we can trust is a very fragile world. You're absolutely right. What happens is in these decentralized systems, the main problem is who's accountable. We're seeing this with Uber right now. So who is accountable when things go wrong? And I am a proponent of these platforms, but I am the first one to say that you cannot extract all the value from the network without being held accountable and responsible for what happens on that platform. So when Facebook say they are not a media company, they are the media company, and they should be held accountable for the content that is posted. When Uber say they take no responsibility to what happens to the passengers because drivers are independent contractors, that is not the world that I was advocating for. So I think in any shift, in any evolution, it's a very fragile state. And I think we all have to take responsibility that, and I'm not just saying this because I love the T word, but trust is society's most precious and fragile asset. And when we put that at stake, when we put that up for sale, we leave ourselves in a very vulnerable place. And I think many of the things that we're seeing right now, many of the topics that we're talking about, they're rising up in that vacuum. They're rising up because trust in all kinds of institutions, whether it is the media, whether it is politicians, whether it is banks, whether it is scientists, religious organisations, it is in a state of collapse. And this is an issue I think we need to be talking about more.
James, it's churches, the media, politicians, the big banks. Why is that?
If I could answer that, Jeremy, I'd be in a better position than I am now. Look, it's a very difficult issue and something I worry about and think about a lot as a politician. As a profession, we've never been particularly highly regarded, but it seems at the moment we're even less well regarded than we used to be, both here in Australia and around the world, and we bear the lion's share of the responsibility of that. But I think technological change has contributed to it too. I think we should not forget that there are some really positive things about this change as well. I think one of the things about the evolution of Twitter and Facebook is that the public square is much more democratic than it once was. It's much easier for people to get an audience and to be heard, and they don't have to go through the gatekeepers that they used to have to go through in the media, where a single newspaper or TV editor had immense power and discretion over what was discussed and what wasn't discussed. So although I share some of Rachel's concerns, I don't think we should forget those positive things too.
Jane, is that shift to peer-to-peer trust a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I think, one of the things that bothers me a lot is, and I'm always telling, I'm spending a lot of my time working with young people, and I'm always having to say to them, just because you see something out on the web, don't necessarily believe it. You must check it out. And young people are beginning to look at something they read and trust it without questioning it. And that's what I think is so terrifying. And, I've been a lot of my time in Africa and places like that, where I've never known politicians to be particularly trusted. And one of the biggest problems, not only in the developing world, but the developed world, is corruption. And somehow the lack of trust, corruption, power, the lust for power, the lust for money, it's all tying together and creating this very frightening world we live in today.
Jane, you've brought a friend along today who's been on Q&A before. He's sharing your shot with you. Just explain to us who this is.
Well, he takes us into a new way of thinking because he's all about the positive side of human nature, which is one of the things that I go around talking about. He was given to me 26 years ago by a man called Gary Horn, which is why he's Mr. H. Went blind at 21 in the US Marines, decided to become a magician, was told, Gary, you can't be a good magician if you're blind. And he said, well, I can try. And not only do the children not know he's blind, but at the end he'll tell them and say, things may go wrong in your life, but don't give up. There's always a way forward. And he does scuba diving and skydiving. He thought he was giving me a stuffed chimpanzee, and I made him hold the tail.
Tail, that's the giveaway.
Chimpanzees don't have tails. He said, never mind, take him with you, and my spirit's with you. So he illustrates the indomitable human spirit that tackles seemingly impossible problems and will not give up. So this problem of trust and corruption is something that seems insoluble, but we must tackle it with our indomitable spirits and overcome it for the sake of our children.
Linda Burney, the status quo as it is, though, it makes it quite difficult to govern, doesn't it, when peer-to-peer trust is held at a higher value sometimes than trust in institutions?
Well, I'm not completely convinced that trust is rushing out the door. One of the rules you live by in the life that I and the space that James occupies, if you lose the trust of the people, you lose your position, your party loses an election, and there is nothing more important than trust between the population and political leadership. I think people are more fed up than a lack of trust. That's my sense of it. And I don't remember a time when people have trusted banks that much anyhow. And I certainly don't remember a time when politicians have been always trusted. But I do think that what Rachel and Jane and others have said has some real validity, But I also go back to when I was a kid living in the country, and the amount of trust amongst rural people, the fact that you could go out, you were pushed out the door at daybreak and said, come back when it's dark. There was an enormous amount of trust in the community, and people trusted each other with their children. So that trust is a different thing to what I think you're talking about in terms of large institutions. But I think everyone has to take some responsibility in this topic. You can't just shoot it home to institutions or shoot it home to politicians. It's everyone's responsibility. And one of the values that I live by is that I trust people until there's a reason not to trust them. And perhaps that might be naive for some of you, but that's the way that I live my life.
Peter Kurti, is that naive?
No, I don't think it is at all. In fact, I'm inclined to agree with Linda. I also share her doubt about the evaporation of trust, because I think trust has to be accompanied by accountability. And what we're seeing with the peer-to-peer economy is actually a great deal of accountability. If you do something on Airbnb or you do something on Uber, you will be held accountable. And people will know about your experience. And I think that will feed through the rest of the people who use Uber and who are part of the Airbnb, for it to take just two examples. I think when institutions are going through a crisis of trust because they're learning that they have to be accountable. Now, sometimes institutions face a massive collapse of trust, and we're seeing that, I think, most spectacularly in not just in this country, but certainly in this country with the Christian churches over the scandal of child sexual abuse. Now, that is a collapse in trust that will take a long time to repair. But we're seeing, I think, the beginnings of an attempt to address it through accountability. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen quickly, and I'm certainly not saying it's going to be complete. But I think if institutions learn that they, too, are accountable and they can't take that for granted, that is to say, they can't take their relationship with the people to whom they provide services for granted, then we will see a reinvigoration of trust. And I think it's the peer-to-peer economy that's teaching the principles of that.
All right, now remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A tonight, send a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanda, and keep an eye on our Twitter account, RMIT ABC FactCheck, and the Conversation website for the results. The next question comes from Timon Reagan.
At a meeting in Uluru organised by the Referendum Council, co-chair Pat Anderson said, "We are not prepared to just take some kind of statement inserted into the Constitution. We want changes that are going to make changes to our lives and ensure we have a say. By increasing the changes in our Constitution, is there now a chance that the referendum will end in a no vote and we won't get anywhere at all?"
Linda Burney.
That is a very good question and a very complex question. Everyone here in the audience and on the panel would be aware that the next proposed referendum for Australia is to recognise Aboriginal people in the Constitution. It would be 50 years since the 1967 referendum, where we first counted Aboriginal people as citizens within the census. And I was 10 years old when that happened, so it wasn't so long ago. The Uluru meeting that has been referred to was a very large number of Aboriginal people who have come to the conclusion that what they want to see in the Australian Constitution is the recognition of a voice of Aboriginal people that would advise the Parliament. And I think that is a very fine aspiration. What needs to happen now is that the Referendum Council will finalise their report, deliver it to the Parliament on the 30th of June, and then it will be up to the Australian Parliament to determine what the questions will be for the referendum and when the referendum will be. Just to finish up on that, your point is a very good one. Could we end up with a no vote or no referendum at all? I think that would be an absolute tragedy, and I think it's the responsibility of all Australians, including the Aboriginal community and members of Parliament, to put forward a question that can be successful and that will finally tell the truth in our nation's birth certificate.
James, you're against any reference to race, positive or negative, in the Constitution. Are these measures being put forward just too ambitious? And ultimately, really, the goal is to improve the life outcomes, educational, health, life expectancy for Aboriginal people.
Yeah, it's not so much whether it's too ambitious or not ambitious enough. I think some of the really interesting things out of Uluru was a widespread agreement that symbolic recognition was not the way to go forward. It had previously been suggested by many people that we should have a preamble of some kind of the Constitution that would symbolically recognise Indigenous Australians, and the Uluru Summit was very clear that was not what they were after. They wanted more tangible results in that, and I completely respect and understand that. I also understand and respect why Aboriginal people feel that they want to have a greater voice in Australian politics and why they want better consultation, because there have been decades of failure in Indigenous policy of governments of both persuasions, so I understand that. There are some big questions to be answered, though, over the coming months about how those things are achieved, how those aspirations are achieved, and I do have some reservations about how we do it in the Constitution. I think there is constitutional risk in enshrining a representative voice of some kind in the Constitution, and I also think, as a matter of principle, that we should always ensure that all Australians are equally represented and have equal opportunity to be represented, and I don't like the idea of dividing Australians by race by saying that some Australians are represented by the Australian Parliament and other Australians are represented by another representative body. It is the job of the Parliament to represent everyone, and if we're not doing that job well enough, well, then we absolutely need to work on that.
But without taking up too much time, and James, what people might not understand, there are already 2 sections in the Australian Constitution that are called the race powers. One is Section 25, which gives state governments the power to ban Aboriginal people from voting. They haven't done it for many, many, many years, but it's still in our Constitution. The other is there is a section called 5126, which gives the federal government the power to make specific laws about groups of people, and they have done that in a negative way as it comes to Aboriginal people. We cannot go forward as a nation having a constitution that gives governments the power to enact laws that could be determined as racist. It's unacceptable.
James, you'd like to see that eliminated. I mean, that's...
Yeah, I
reference to race.
I entirely agree with Linda on that. I think that Section 25, as you said, is redundant and unnecessary. There'd be no harm if that was removed. Section 5126, as starting from a first basis of principles, I would prefer it not be in there. But one of the things that some Indigenous leaders have told us is if you took out 5126, that would damage, for example, native title laws and would create uncertainty about native title laws. So while if we were writing a constitution today, it will include no references to race, it's in many in the Indigenous community who tell us we must have at least a power there to make laws for Indigenous people, whether it's for the promotion of culture or history or language. There must be some way of the federal government addressing these issues.
Jane, you've been watching this debate from afar, from the outside. What do you make of it?
Well, I don't know enough about the Constitution, really, to comment. I've worked a lot with...
It's OK, Jane. Most Australians don't.
The idea of treaty and recognising our First Peoples.
Well, I mean, I've worked a lot with Indigenous people in North America, the First Nation, the Native Americans, in Taiwan, in China, in Africa, and in so many cases, almost every country I can think of, the Indigenous people have not been treated well. They've been let down. There may be laws enacted, but they're not followed through. So I'm always on the side of the Indigenous people because they have just been treated very, very shabbily.
Peter Kurti?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think there is no doubt that many Indigenous people in this country do suffer and have suffered great disadvantage. I do have a question about whether changing the Constitution is the way to address that disadvantage. I think the race powers, I agree with Linda and James, I think the race powers, for the most part, could go, and that would be OK and unexceptional, and I think that would succeed at a referendum. My concern about changing the Constitution is that the Australian Constitution, unlike the American Constitution, is really just a rule book for government. It just sets out how government works. And if there's a problem in our society, I don't think that changing the Constitution, that is to say, operating on the assumption that the Constitution is broken, is the way to address that problem. It would have symbolic value, but would it really address questions of disadvantage, which we know to be persistent and in some parts of this country to be endemic? The concern I do have about the Constitution is that I think if we were to change it, we could end up dividing our nation into racial and ethnic groups. And, do you know, that is something I would really want us to avoid, because I think Australia is a great country. We are a cohesive country. When you look around other parts of the world, you can really see what a wonderful country we live in. And if we were to find that we were gradually being divided into ethnic and racial groups, I think it would weaken the overall social cohesion of our country. But that is not to deny for one moment the very pressing problem of Indigenous disadvantage that we successive governments need to address.
There's a recognition that constitutional reform wouldn't necessarily address those social justice issues, and we should not conflate the two. Those social justice issues are just appalling, and they are there, and we all understand why. They should be addressed whether or not there's constitutional reform.
Yes. Rachel, you've lived in Great Britain, in the United States, you're now in Australia. How do you observe these race relations in this country, particularly concerning Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
Yes, I am a smorgasbord of nationalities, or a mutt. I don't know enough about the Constitution. I'm with Jane. I am actually flabbergasted listening to you, Linda, that there is something in the Constitution that can deny people of Australia the right to vote. I think that is absolutely appalling. You know, the interesting thing, living around the world, I've now lived in every continent apart from Antarctica. Human beings are human beings. And when we put laws and partitions in place that in some way creates divide, whatever that divide is about, whether it's about race, religion, gender, it is not a good thing for society. So even though I don't know about this particular issue, I used to work in politics. I generally fall on the side that any kind of partition that highlights difference, denies people rights and opportunities is something that should be changed.
Now, remember, you can join the discussion on Twitter and on Q&A Extra, on Facebook Live and ABC News Radio straight after this program. Now, you may have heard in the news that the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, has called on prospective citizens to act as Australian patriots. On that note, our next question comes from George Lindsay.
Labor MPs have accused the government's tougher citizenship requirements as stoking xenophobia. What is xenophobic about ensuring that new Australians are loyal to the country they are now part of, and that they are prepared to contribute to Australia through having proficiency in English and a substantial knowledge of their new country?
Linda, what's wrong with loyalty and learning English?
There is nothing wrong with loyalty, and there's nothing wrong with learning English. But I think what has gotten lost in this debate about citizenship is that you cannot become a citizen of Australia unless you have unless you're a permanent resident. So those people that go to citizenship ceremonies, and I attend many of them, they're the most uplifting experiences, are already permanent residents of Australia. So they've been through a very stringent vetting process to become a permanent resident. That's important to understand. And when you look at the oath that people take at citizenship ceremonies, you are committing yourself to the laws of this country. You're committing yourself to this country. But clearly, this debate has to be couched in safety and in protecting Australia from many of the strifes that obviously we see around the world. I accept that. But I don't want to lose the fact that whatever the changes are, they have to be fair and they have to be done in the national interest. You've mentioned the learning English. Under the AMES, which is the institution that teaches English to migrants in Australia, they are required to teach to level 4. This test, we believe, is requiring people to have level 6 or university English. Now, is that really fair for people who are escaping terrible situations to be able to only get citizenship if they have that level 6 when AMES only teaches to level 4? That's a discussion we have to have. Labor hasn't come to a conclusion about our stand on the new citizenship laws. We'll be having that discussion in caucus this week. We may accept all of it or we may look at parts of it, but that's a discussion we have. But it must be fair and it must be in the national interest They are the two tests.
Jeremy, can I just...
Please do.
I am actually taking my citizenship test this Friday, so my 5-year-old has been coaching me, and I'm very proud, actually, of how much he's learned about Australian history. I do think certain things need to be changed. The definition of larrikin, I don't think, is necessary to become an Australian citizen, or knowing what an Esky or a Lamington or Donald Bradman score is really things that shouldn't even be part of the booklet. But on a serious note, I think... I'm really against this English proficiency test because basically what it's saying is that you have to be proficient in English to contribute to society, to respect living in Australia. I come from a family of immigrants. I don't think they could speak the language when they fled, and they still made a positive contribution to the society. So I think we need to be very careful about saying that you have to be proficient in English. I encourage you to look at the work of Alexander Betts. He has looked at the economic contribution of immigrants, and being fluent in a language is not one of the measures that is required.
James Paterson, I'll get your reply. Can the government be legitimately accused of stoking xenophobia? Do you accept the potential for someone who may have a different motive to take that idea and run in a very different direction with it?
I don't think so. I mean, we've always, as a country, screened potential migrants for their skills and for their health and for their security and other things. But one thing which we haven't actually screened for in the past is values. And I think that's a really important part of being a migrant to Australia, and certainly if you want to become a citizen here. And some of the things that we're looking at, including in the values test in the citizenship application, is an acceptance and understanding that domestic violence is completely unacceptable in Australia. I don't think it's xenophobic to expect and to require new migrants to abide by that, or to respect freedom of speech or freedom of religion or equality before the law. I mean, these are principles that we seek to uphold and maintain in Australia, and we'll find that much more easy to do if all the new migrants who are seeking to become citizens share those values and a commitment to those values. I'm also very happy to defend a tough English language requirement. I think if you're seeking to become a citizen, which will be after at least 4 years as a permanent resident, you should be able to speak English, and it is important to be able to communicate with your neighbours and your colleagues and your co-workers and your friends in order to integrate successfully in society. It's not just good for the society, but it's good for you as an individual as well.
Jane, this sort of debate has been happening in the UK as well. What do you make of it? Is it a worthwhile discussion and one that's needed?
Well, I think it's I haven't followed it particularly closely. It's going on in the United States as well, where it's being taken to extremes by Donald Trump, closing the borders of the country to people from 6 primarily Muslim countries. And it's, the important thing is that the people who come in are people who can contribute, as you said. They need to be able to contribute. They do need to be able to understand what's going on around them, so they certainly need to know some English, and that's the same in the UK as well.
Peter Kurti, so where does this leave, I want to ask you, where does this leave the pursuit of diversity? If people are being told that they need to fit in first and foremost, is diversity out the window there?
No, I don't think it is. I think any sovereign state is entitled to decide who is going to become a citizen. And I would distinguish between social integration and cultural integration. Because what this language test, and I speak as somebody who not only, I became a citizen 20-odd years ago, and I'm rather glad we didn't have tough sporting questions, because I think I would have flunked them, although I could have spoken quite eloquently about Scotland's victory over Australia on Saturday, about which we need to say a little more. But I think that social integration, if somebody has a command of English, they will find it's easier for them to find their way into the life of the country. It's not about foregoing their cultural identity. My father was a migrant to the UK. He learned English and their rather peculiar pre-decimal system of currency by being a bus conductor. And that's how he learned, and that's how he came to integrate into English society many years ago now. So I think that social integration is actually a really important thing, and people can struggle with language for sure, and they may not be eloquent and they may struggle with literacy. But I think that if a test for citizenship encourages people to learn a language so that they can integrate, it helps to overcome what might lead to social isolation, which has a whole series of problems associated with it.
But surely, Jeremy, the question is who determines what the values are? And I have no idea who has decided what the values are for us as Australians, but that would be an interesting question to ask.
Is it up to the First Peoples?
Well, I don't know if any Aboriginal people, First People, have even been consulted in terms of what those values are. And, you know, we are one of the most extraordinary countries with our diversity. Just look around the audience tonight. Is that diversity part of our values that are being required to be answered in this citizenship test? I have no idea.
Except that James has really just addressed that, surely, because he's talking about principles like respect for the rule of law, respect for...
That is already in the pledge that you make when you're a citizen, become a citizen. So
Linda, to come back to Rachel's observations about her own upcoming test, I agree with her. Knowing Donald Bradman's batting average, as interesting as that is not actually a useful thing to study. And you know, all the other examples she gave, I'd much rather know whether, as a new migrant, they accept the principle of freedom of religion, which means that you can have faith or not have faith, that if you are of a faith, you can choose to leave your faith or change your faith. I mean, that's a really important thing that I think reflects the diversity that you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying, I wonder who's determining what the values are.
You and I, Linda, will be voting on it in the Parliament, and if you're not happy with it, you can vote against it. That's the opportunity you have as a representative on behalf of everyone.
Can I
here.
ask you to change one of the questions?
You may.
Because there is one question around values. It's the demonstration of Australian values, and the correct answer is that men and women are treated equally. That is not the correct answer. So within the test itself, before any reform is made, there are assumptions made around values. I would assume it feels very male in terms of the test itself, but that question needs to change.
All right, we'll have to move along to our next question, which comes from Maya Bertolini.
According to the New York Times, in the past 3,400 years, humans have been at peace for only 268 of them, or just 8% of recorded history. Given that we are told how much we have in common with our primates, what can we learn from their social behaviours in an attempt to regain and maintain peace in our society?
Jane.
Well, unfortunately, chimpanzees are very, very like humans in a lot of their behaviour. And I say unfortunately because when I began to study them and realised how like us they were in so many ways, I thought they were like us but nicer. And then I discovered that, like us, they have a dark side and they're capable of violence, brutality, even a kind of primitive war. But like us, they also have a side that's compassionate and loving and altruistic. They are very good at solving problems, but the way they solve problems is not a way that I think would actually work in human society. And we have to remember that the one...
Why is that?
Well, I'm coming to it, but the reason it wouldn't work is that in their society, might is right. And so if you're a subordinate, if you're a female, for example, and you're attacked by a male, it obviously, quite clearly, the male is in the wrong. But the way the conflict is resolved is that the female will approach nervously, she may reach her hand out, she may be crouching, she may even in her fear turn away, but crouch, and then the conflict will be resolved when the male reaches out and gently pats her. And I don't think that's the kind of way we want to resolve our problems. The chimpanzee, the ape that used to be called the pygmy chimpanzee, the bonobo, they are equally biologically different from us as the chimpanzee. They resolve their conflicts through sex. And I don't think that that's the way, really, that although I did say that certain presidents might actually enjoy that.
Oh, well, that's a picture. Peter Kurti, when the question was about peace in humanity, when you look at primates, I mean, does it make more sense to look at primates to learn about peace than it does to look to God?
It's a really good question. And I think conflict does seem to be endemic to human life. I know very little about primates, so I'll just stick to humans. I think one of the things that religion tries to address, I mean, and most religions, as far as I'm aware, do this, is to recognise the incompleteness of human nature and that a worship of a god, attendance to divine law, following divine law, is a way of completing a deficiency in the human character. That deficiency is seldom ever met completely. But I think religion provides a wider framework, a bigger framework that allows people to aspire to a way of life, a standard of life, a set of ethical principles that they would otherwise fall short of. And in trying to meet them, they often fall short of them. But I think that religion recognises that incompleteness in human nature, and in their faltering ways, human beings who are religious, I think, recognise that and try to live a more complete life.
Rachel Botsman?
It's funny, I'm reading a book at the moment on this. It's a book by Yuval Harari. It's called Sapiens. It's a brilliant book. It's interesting you raise that point of religion because the point he makes is that most unrest is actually caused by religion. That it's the divisiveness of religion that causes humankind to fight. So I'm not an expert on this topic, but it is an interesting, it is a fascinating book in terms of the evolution of man. And when I did read it, I had the same reaction as you, is that humankind, I should say, has very rarely been at peace. And how we fight over the same things, we never learn. So are human beings predictable?
But isn't it true that in all the major religions, it's the fanatical side of it that causes the fighting? It's not the religion itself. I mean, every single religion has the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's shared by every religion that I know.
I think that's right. I think that's right. And I think that religion can be an easy way, or it's easy to dismiss religion as being the cause of violence. But, I mean, Stalinist Russia was not a religious society, nor was Maoist China. So religion doesn't cause violence, but some religious people do provoke violence. And certainly religion is one feature of human society that causes division.
But is it some kind of ideological doctrine? So if it's not religion, it is Stalinism. If it's not Islam, it's Hitler and Mussolini. I mean, is that the essence of a lot of conflict?
I think people do fight over ideology, and and when ideologies conflict or compete with one another, that can generate conflict. So yes, I think so.
Or are we just all acting like chimpanzees?
Perhaps. But there is some good news on this front. There's an economist at Harvard University, Steven Pinker, who's tracked violence and conflict throughout history. And what he shows is it might not feel like it, but the age we're living in now is one of the most conflict-free, violence-free ages in human history. So that shows we're making progress. I know it doesn't always feel like that, but compared to the horrors of World War, what we're experiencing today is a much lower level of conflict and violence.
But the flip side of that is there's studies showing that hatred has never been so high.
Yeah, and distrust. And if you were living in Syria right now, you wouldn't agree with Pinker at all.
Yeah.
Right. Our next question comes from Tyne Jones.
When I was 9, I started the Ape Family Foundation to raise money to help chimps and other primates at Taronga Zoo. As primary school students, we don't have a lot of power or influence. But what can we do to help prevent the destruction of natural habitats and the exploitation and hunting of primates?
Well, actually, yes. There's actually an awful lot you can do. And I want to tell you about a program that we have. Have you heard of Roots and Shoots? You have. Because in our youth program, Roots and Shoots, is the program of the Jane Goodall Institute, now in 99 countries, with 150,000 active groups from kindergarten through university, all choosing projects to make the world a better place. One for people, one for other animals, and one for the environment. And I can promise you, there are young people just like you. They're becoming chimpanzee guardians. They're learning about and helping to protect the rainforest where most of the primates live. And it's actually making a huge difference. So you as an individual just have to remember that in your life you matter. You have a role to play. and that every single day you live, you make some impact and you get a choice as to what kind of impact you're going to make. Now imagine there are billions of people making ethical choices each day as to what you buy, what you wear, what you eat, how was it made, where did it come from, did it involve cruelty to animals or child slave labour? Then if everyone's making the right ethical choice, whatever religion they're part of, then we're going to have a much better world for you as you grow up and for the primates. And I can't help adding one more thing here. We have this expression, you must have it in Australia, we haven't inherited this planet from our parents, we've borrowed it from our children. We have not borrowed our children's future, we have stolen it and we're still stealing it now. And it's time we get together, whatever our religion, whatever our culture, get together and start changing the way, changing our attitude, so that we can leave a better world for our children, whom we love.
Peter Kurti, what advice do you have for an 11-year-old?
I think it's a great question, and I admire your maturity and your wisdom. I think take very seriously what Jane has said, and I think that as you grow up, you will experience even more the responsibility that you have as a human being, as a citizen of this country, and that you have every opportunity to make a difference to the future of this country. I really can't add much to what Jane has said because I think she has said it so eloquently, but it was beautiful advice, and I would just encourage you and wish you very, very well and congratulate you on the efforts that you've undertaken already. You've achieved more in your young years than many of us here will have done.
Linda?
Thank you, Tyne. I wanted to just expand a little bit on what Jane has said. For many years, I've worked in the Aboriginal space, and part of that has been during the formal process of reconciliation. I also see so many, and I talk to thousands and thousands of young people, and often it's, oh, look, you know, I'm one person, what I do doesn't make a difference. The problems are so big. It's climate change. It's nuclear war, and I just don't think that what I do makes a difference. Can I just say to Tyne and everyone else that is what makes the difference. It's what individual people do. It's the humble acts. It's the small acts that bring about the great changes. We can be legislators. We can be leading lights and speaking on the media all the time, but the real change comes from what individual peoples do in their homes, in their families, in their schools, in the various groups that you're part of. So don't ever think that you don't have power to change anything, because the power lies with you to make the changes. I've seen it, I've been part of it, and I really wanted to say that.
James Paterson, you are the youngest ever Liberal senator. What advice do you have for a young conservationist?
Well, I'm a little bit older than you, but not a lot older than you. And it wasn't all that long ago that I was in school and I was passionate about things and I was reading things in the newspaper that made me angry or that I wanted to get involved in. And what I've found is that the barriers to be involved and have influence in public policy and political life in Australia are actually very low. And I think they're lower than they ever have been. And you could choose, like me, to do that through a formal political system and join a political party, or there are many other ways of doing it. There's lots of other organisations that are dedicated to causes or activism, like Jane's and many others. So I think there's just so many opportunities to have influence if that's what you're passionate about. And if you want to dedicate your life to that, you can have a very satisfying life making a difference to things that are important to you.
Rachel Botsman?
As you asked me that question, I was thinking of a supervisor I had at Oxford. She actually tragically passed away last year, and she wrote an amazing book called The Power of Impossible People. It's an amazing book, and the one thing that she taught me and that I really miss not having around is that she had faith in every human being. And that's the thing. I think it's easy to say that you have power and influence. I think as you go out into the world, it's very easy to lose that faith in the world and in other human beings. And I just encourage you to hold on to that.
There's time for one last question now. It comes from David McGonigal.
My question's for Dr. Goodall. Recently, we've seen human populations acting with what seems to me like increasingly apparent irrationality. For example, the election of President Trump and Brexit. Have you ever observed similar decisions against the common good by a troop of chimpanzees?
Really, honestly, chimpanzees are out for themselves, but they also, as I've said, show altruism. But when we come into the kind of things that you're talking about, electing Trumps and Brexit, you know, it's so far removed from the chimpanzees living their very simple life where males seek to achieve dominance, where they have a territory marked out, where if they spy individuals from a neighbouring social group, they will chase if they catch the unfortunate victim, attack so badly that that individual will die of wounds inflicted. So there isn't a mechanism in their societies that I could even begin to relate to the election of Donald Trump and Brexit. And you know, Brexit, in a way, those two things stem from the same source. People, sections of the population that were kept down, that didn't have enough education, who couldn't get the right jobs because of that. They were angry and they wanted change. And so when they saw that they were being offered change, they hadn't really been through all the education. They didn't analyse exactly what was being promised and ask themselves, is this really true? And a great example of that is the day after the Brexit answer came through, the most frequently asked question on Google was, what is the EU? That's true. So it just shows that they listened to everything they were told. They didn't analyse it. They didn't question it. And it's the opposite of what we began the conversation with about trust. They implicitly trusted what they were told, both by Trump and by the Conservative Party in the UK.
Rachel, we're talking about your former homelands, Britain and the UK. The UK and America. Were these sort of decisions so irrational?
No, I mean, just linking a few things that have been said, I think Trump and Brexit, they are symptoms of the same problem. And really what we're seeing is three things coming together, and this relates to the conversation that we were talking about of lack of trust in institutions is one, lack of accountability of authorities and elites. The second is an inversion of influence, which is incredibly dangerous. So this lack of trust in authorities, experts, scientists, academics, economists. I rarely agree with anything Michael Gove said, but I don't know if you remember that interview where he said, you know, people have had enough of experts in this country. And there was an element that was right. And then the third thing is echo chambers, that we're growing up in these echo chambers, we're not letting in dissenting views, and most importantly, they're amplifying our fears. And what's happening is that every incident is chipping away at people's confidence in the system. And maybe it is less about trust, maybe it's a loss of faith. And what's happening is that this is creating a dangerous vacuum where feeling trumps fact, and you can look at any politician, whether it is Trump, whether it is Corbyn, they know how to play that card. They know how to talk to a whole population. And I don't think it's, my dad's going to kill me for saying this, but he actually voted to leave the European Union. He's an educated man. And when I asked him for his rationale, he was like, anything is better than what we have now. And when I heard that, I thought, oh my goodness, how disenfranchised, how disenchanted is the English population? And I've just come back from the UK, and it is it's not a scary place to be, but it just feels adrift. I mean, it just feels lost and just struggling to rediscover its purpose. And I think that's where we are seeing voices like Boris Johnson, like Michael Gove, Jeremy Corbyn rising up because people are scared and they don't know what to listen to.
Peter Kurti?
I take a rather more optimistic view of human nature. And I think that what we've seen in the election of Donald Trump and in Brexit, both of which are very democratic exercises where people exercise a legitimate choice, and those who lost the debate, with the exception perhaps of Hillary Clinton, but those who lost the argument accepted the result of the majority. And I think that human society, or rather liberal democratic societies, have a way of correcting and adjusting themselves. I think Trump and Brexit were about two different things. There are connections, but I think Trump was I mean, it's hard to simplify, but I think essentially was about a reaction to the political establishment. I think Brexit was about sovereignty and about a reclaiming of sovereignty. I voted in neither the British nor the American elections, I have to say. But I think that in time these will correct, and we don't see democracy under threat much, though the people say we do, but I don't think we do see democracy under threat. And I think when elections are held, people abide by the results, as we saw with Theresa May recently in her election. So I think that we go through periods of change, we go through ups and downs, but I do have great faith in democratic systems to correct themselves over time. So I'm an optimist about human nature.
Linda Burney, James Paterson, you're both part of parties that got rid of sitting prime ministers. I wonder, you know, in terms of doing shooting yourself,
before our time.
Yes, but shooting your own party in the foot, is that the sort of expression of, you know, what our questioner is saying about doing what's not for the greater good and suffering a detriment because
I think that what Rachel has said and what I said earlier is that people are fed up, they're frustrated, and quite often people say, well, we'll give someone else a go because we're not happy with what's going on at the moment in politics. But I get back to the point that what people who vote for politicians want is they want politicians to care about them. They want politicians to understand what their issues are. And I think that one of the things that would be very useful for political parties across the globe to do is to demystify what the process is about. I mean, I was in a grocery store a few months ago and a woman came up to me and said, do you really do your own shopping? And I just thought, well, you should have seen what I was cleaning up an hour ago. But it's that kind of a misunderstanding, I think, about the role, but we have a responsibility to show you that we can be trusted and that we are people that care about you. I think one of the most stunning political things on the international forecast that we see is what happened in France with Macron, who didn't even have a party, and now has just swept up 400 and something seats. I mean, that's extraordinary. And you've got to say, well, what's going on there? And it really is about trust, I think.
James Paterson?
I'm very fortunate that I came into the parliament after the leadership change in my party, and so I had no involvement in it. And one of the things that, because of that perspective that I have, that I've become really clear to me is that so many people invest their frustrations and their anger or their hopes in a particular leader as if it's down to that one leader, and if we just change the leader, everything will be good or everything will be bad. In politics, if you're unhappy with the system and the policies you're getting, the leader is much a symptom as they are a cause. And just as people have invested their hopes in Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn and Emmanuel Macron, I think ultimately they will be disappointed in them because it's not... We don't live in a democratic dictatorship where a leader can just impose their will and dictate to the country what's going to happen, what's not going to happen. And frankly, I don't think it'd be a very good thing to live in a system like that. So if you want change, then it's about much more fundamental, deep down things than who's the one leader of the day.
But it also has to be about good policy that is going to meet what people expect. And I think sometimes there isn't enough discussion about policy and there's too much discussion on personality.
I entirely agree. And
on that bipartisan note, can we just get a quick final word from you, Jane? Do we learn from our mistakes? Are we capable of it as a species?
Of learning from our mistakes? Well, we...
Or are we doomed?
I don't think we're doomed at all. We can learn from our mistakes. Unfortunately, very often we do not learn from our mistakes. But again, I have to come back to this youth programme we have because it's my biggest hope for the future. because one of the things that is so important in our Roots and Shoots is young people meeting around the world, very often through social media, because it's too expensive to bring them all together. And one of the things that's coming out of it is their understanding to break down the barriers that we build between people of different nations, different cultures, different religions, and between us and the natural world. They're learning that the DNA proves that we're all one family, the DNA of humans, whether we're Aboriginal, whether we have black, yellow, white, or whatever coloured skin we have, whatever clothes we wear. If we're hurt, we cry and our tears are the same. If we cut ourselves, the blood that comes out is the same. If we cry, our tears are the same. We are one family.
And that is an uplifting note to leave it on. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Linda Burney, Peter Kurti, Jane Goodall, James Paterson and Rachel Botsman. Remember, you can tune into the discussion on Q&A Extra with Tracy Holmes and the Director of the Australian Museum, Kim McKay. They're taking comments on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live as soon as we finish here. Next week, Virginia Trioli will be hosting Q&A and digging deep into the weeds of politics with Alistair Campbell, the archetypal hard-hitting spin doctor who advised Tony Blair. The Cabinet Insider, Leader of the House and self-declared fixer, Christopher Pyne, the Shadow Minister for Justice, Claire O'Neill, visiting American pollster and political analyst Anne Greenberg, and John Howard's longtime confidant and advisor Graham Morris. Thanks for joining me on Q&A. We'll see you again soon. Good night.
Still got something to say? Join the discussion on Q&A Extra now on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live.